Hello and welcome to Risk at Work, Risk Connect's educational webinar series. I'm Scott Fenstermaker, I'm VP of Digital Marketing. Today we're going to be talking about controlling the uncontrollable risks. For those of us who have been connected with ERM or GRC or continuity for a little while, we're used to thinking about risks in different kinds of categories. We probably separate them into, for example, internal risks, which are typically a little bit more preventable, and we want to prevent them as much as our time and our budget allow, things like safety and fraud and non-compliance, things that are mostly controllable or mitigatable. We then have a category of risk that is external, but we can at least mitigate it to an extent or influence it to a certain extent. We have to live in a world of government policies. We might be able to extend some influence to those policies. We might be able to control for what changes may come, but that's an example of a risk where it is perchance maybe outside of our control as well. Today, we're going to be talking about the third category of risks, the uncontrollable external risks, those risks that include the higher impact, less predictable tail risks that we have a hard time seeing coming, but nonetheless need to do something about. We're going to ask the question whether or not this third category of risks, the risks that we have the hardest time seeing coming, are simply a cost of doing business, or whether or not we could take a strategic approach to prepare ourselves, at least to an extent, for those things that we can't see coming our way. A couple of housekeeping items before I introduce our guest today. First of all, if you have questions for our guest, please put them into the question prompt in the webinar software. If we don't answer the question during the discussion, we will get back to you individually with an answer from our guest today. Also, if you indicated that you would like CPE credit for attending this webinar, please watch your inbox after we're done today. We will send you a short quiz based on what we discussed here today. You answer a couple of questions, fill it back out and turn it back to us, and we will respond with your CPE credit. All right. I am thrilled today because we have a new presenter making her Risk at Work debut, and I've been waiting for this for a long time. We are so lucky to have with us today Vanessa Mathews. Vanessa Mathews is the founder and chief resilience officer of Asphalis Advisors. For those of you wondering what an Asphalis is, that is the Greek term meaning safe, secure, and sure. So absolutely an expert in what we're about to talk about today. She is an adjunct professor and board advisor. She is also the host of the Business Resilience Decoded podcast with over 40,000 subscribers. She is noted as a Mecklenburg Times 50 most influential women on her knee. We are thrilled to introduce today Vanessa Mathews. Vanessa, how are you doing?
Hey, I am doing well, Scott. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. We've been able to meet a couple of times offline. Now we're finally being able to bring your point of view to this series and this discussion, and I couldn't be more thrilled for you to be here.
Absolutely. Well, thank you.
Thank you. So we're talking about uncontrollable risks today. You've brought a lot of wonderful knowledge with you. So why don't you get into that and tell us about what this is and what we can do about it?
Yeah. So, one of the concepts our team has been working on is understanding what are the common themes that we're hearing across our customers. And one of the things that keeps coming up is whether you're an HR director, the head of operations, or if you're in marketing, they're being asked to understand a little bit about supply chain risk, a little bit about cybersecurity, a little bit about what's shifting within our workforces, in addition to their normal day to day jobs in HR and marketing and operations, coupled with understanding and managing your own business, and then having to become risk aware in areas where they traditionally have not had to do that. And so there's this question that has continuously come up of how do we control what we feel like we have no control over? And sometimes when I look at the society that we're in today, with the different aspects that are happening around us, it feels like as an individual, I don't have any way of managing what the things are that are coming our way, whether it's me as a person or as a business. And so we thought it would be important to kind of talk through how do you quote unquote control what feels like it's uncontrollable. And so when we think about geopolitical risks, that can show up as Russia's war in Ukraine. It can show up as security environments that are trending in a downward direction across different countries. It can also show up as this concept of a permacrisis, where it feels like we're in a constant, perpetual state of a crisis. And what used to be maybe a 24 to 48 or 72-hour crisis incident is now more long term, right? When we think about political unrest, that can show up as protests due to elections. It can show up as the France protests over pension reform. It can show up as opposing or conflicting views that we're seeing from a election or elected official perspective. When we think about insider threats, there's been recent reports about the cost of insider threats and the global and how that shows up globally. And we're seeing that those trends are moving upward and they've risen by 44% over the past 2 years. And so, and then if you think about natural disasters, right, that's something that's more commonplace, especially for those of us who might be in cities where you experience hurricanes or floods or wildfires. But what I consistently have been hearing is that natural disasters are happening more frequently. And sometimes, especially from a US perspective, every day we are experiencing a natural disaster, right? And so again, where are the resources at for us to be able to handle and to manage that? And so what we wanted to kind of think through was if we can understand what an uncontrollable event looks like, what are some of those characteristics that we're seeing that they have in common? They're swift, they're turbulent, it feels like it's out of control, and I typically don't have direct contact with the source. So for example, if we think about geopolitical conflicts, I don't know anybody on my team who has direct contact with Russia or Ukraine, right? And so while I may be able to send aid and to donate some resources, typically I don't have the direct contact with the immediate source. And so that's just to kind of give us a picture of what some of those uncontrollable things might look like. So as a further example, when we think about what we've seen across the United States, specifically regarding the electrical substation attacks, the reality is we live in a world where we all need power and energy. And so when those things are stripped away from us, it creates challenges on a personal level and a business level. Specifically, where I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, two North Carolina power substations were attacked. There was no warning, and it was an uncontrollable event, especially when you were on the receiving end of that. A state of emergency was declared, and that disruption lasted for days. So luckily, backup generators were available to put to use for other aspects of critical infrastructure like the hospitals, the water, and the sewage plants. But the concern is that if you think about the risk profile of electric substations and how vulnerable they are in our country and the dependence that we all have on the grid, it starts to concern you when you think about that there's a lot of attacks and that they are strategic in terms of what's been happening specifically just with the substations from a US perspective. So there's an interesting report that has come out, and it's called Mayhem, Murder, and Misdirection. Violent extremist attack plots against critical infrastructure in the United States between the periods of 2016 and 2022. And there's also an interesting program at the campus of George Washington University on extremism. And I would encourage you, if those of you who have interest in that, to take a look. And what I can appreciate about the report is it talks about the attack planners and the attempts to target different aspects of critical infrastructure. Some focus more predominantly on commercial facilities, some on government facilities, some on emergency services, and some on the energy sector. But what we've seen consistently is that since 2019, extremist groups have continued to plot against these aspects of critical infrastructures and systems, and they have continuously increased since 2019. And so as we think back to a uncontrollable event appearing as swift, turbulent, and out of control, these are concepts or ideas that come to mind when we think about just specifically the electrical substation attacks as one example. If we fast forward to a completely different vantage point, when we think about the humanitarian crisis that we're seeing from a global perspective, sometimes it's created by war, sometimes because of war, it can become an output. Also, just because of what's happening from a demographic standpoint different people moving across different regions, as well as the scarcity of food, plus global warming, different things can be a root cause to what's happening from a humanitarian crisis and a food perspective. And so what's interesting is BBC came out with a report and talked about when McDonald's, as one example, had to pull out of Russia, had to pull out of Ukraine, that accounted for 9% of the fast food giant's global sales. And so just think about that. If you're a business owner and you are asked to pull out 9% of your portfolio, how do you move forward? But then also thinking about how does that impact the economy or the countries that I'm in? How many jobs were lost? How many employees were affected? How many communities may be dependent on that? Especially if you think about areas that may have a food disparity. How does that show up in those communities? And what's the ripple effect? It's more than just the revenue and the jobs, right? There's a bigger impact that happens when we pull key employers and key organizations out of key locations. And so, as an example, the Starbucks, the Levi's, the Apples, the Coca-Colas of the world, many of these organizations have had a stake or a footprint in Russia and or Ukraine, just as two examples. What happens when those brands have to pull out of those countries, and what does that look like? And so Petroleum is another example that lost about 20% of its stake in Russia um, as it pulled out because of what happened in terms of the war. And so it's important for us as risk professionals to really have a global view of what's happening across the world, because those things typically have a trickle down effect into our everyday lives and the communities and the businesses that we're operating in. I always believe that while a business, most global businesses started as a small business, right? And small businesses are in the fabric and they're in the DNA of many communities. It starts with people, it starts with families, then you go to communities, then you go to cities, and then counties, and then regions, and then at the national level and an international level. But typically things have to build, right, from just that one community. And so I think it's important that we continue to pay attention to what might some of these uncontrollable events look like, and then how do we start to notice those characteristics. One of the taglines that we have in our business is we help you see so you can solve. So we believe that until you can see something, it's hard to solve for something, right? So in my marriage, right, let's take a look at that. So I've been married for 5 years. I'm 5 years new, right? And we always were told, well, communicate, communicate, communicate. Well, sometimes it requires a third party to help me see how I may or may not be communicating effectively so I can see, so I can solve in my own marriage, right? And so I think the same thing holds true in business. In order for us to see our risk, we have to maybe look at them from a different vantage point. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about in today's webinar are a few strategies that we've come up to help us to be able to see differently as risk professionals. So, in looking at the impacts to organizations, so if you are leading a risk management team, a business continuity team, disaster recovery, or even security or communications, these impacts from supply chain to food insecurity to loss of revenue to impacts to your personnel to the assets or the facilities that you manage within your portfolio, these are common for you. This is the world that you live in because you own these risks. And the reason why I think this is important is because these risks are showing up, or these impacts are showing up in your business as a result of these uncontrollable events. So whether it's showing up from a vendor perspective, whether it's showing up within your workforce, if we think about injuries to personnel, and the mental health, the state of your workforce, the ability for people to be able to come to work and operate effectively with everything that's happening around us, those things are showing up and it's impacting you in some way, shape, or form. If we think about it from a facility perspective, where you decide to pick a location, the transportation for you to get in and out of that facility, the roads, the infrastructure, the bridges that are required for your workforce to be able to get there, the safety of your locations. In 2020, when the pandemic happened and protests broke out, uh, we have customers who are in the REIT business. So they own a slate of malls and they have storefronts. And many of those tenants in key metropolitan cities uh, did not have a nice building or nice grass or nice parking lots to walk into as 60 days of continuous protests erupted across the country, right? And so what does that do to your business for people to be able to access those facilities? And sometimes it's not even a protest. Sometimes it's a water break that happens and my building is shut down, or something that might be more detrimental, like an act of violence. And so the reality is that these things show up in our business, and they also show up from a financial perspective. So while it may hit my people, my suppliers, my facilities, and my assets, or my technology, it's also showing up on my balance sheet and on my P&L. And I can take you through 7 of these impacts, and we can look at each of your companies and think through, okay, how does supply chain disruption impact my P&L? Where is that hitting me at? What department? How does that show up on my balance sheet? And how does that impact the ability for us to be able to think strategically, to drive growth and initiatives? Or how is it helping us to kind of think through how do we mitigate some of these risks based upon what the tolerance is? And so the point of this is just to level set, to understand that while some things might show up and appear as if they cannot be controlled, um, we have solutions for those things, but also it's important because these impacts are literally costing us in different ways, some of them direct and some of them that are indirect. And it's important for us to continue to put strategies together to think through that. And so, what was really helpful in preparing for today's conversation is a study that we came across from PricewaterhouseCoopers that talked about the future of the workforce. And what does it look like if we just envision? So just close your eyes and imagine that you're in a white room and you have a white canvas. And if you had different ways for you to think about the future of the workforce from 2023 up to 2030, what would that workforce look like? And one of the things that I've appreciated from this report is that there's 5 major forces that came out through this study. And those are the things that I want to talk through with you today to level set on some of these forces that also really tie into what appears as an uncontrollable event. So the first force is technological breakthroughs. So in some instances, there's an opportunity for rapid advances in technological innovation, and we can see how that can happen through the year of 2030. And that may show up differently depending on the communities that we're in. So if I'm in a large metropolitan city, that sounds about right because I have access to those resources. Those companies are buying into investments to come and grow that footprint. But then also think about, well, what about if I'm in a community that may not be as technologically advanced? Do we have the infrastructure to support these rapid advances? Do we have the jobs to support these rapid advances? Do we have the school systems in place or the trade schools in place to help teach people how to stay competitive in these environments? And then how do we manage the digital divide that may exist in some of these locations? And so while technological breakthroughs are a major force, it can also show up as a significant risk, also causing job displacement. And in some cases, we're seeing that. But the question is, what happens when those things rapidly advance at a rate that maybe we haven't experienced yet within our lifetime? The second major force is demographic shifts. And what's interesting about this is currently there's a change in the size of demographics, the distribution, and the age profile of the world's population. So, in talking about my own family, my parents are baby boomers and they're getting at a place where they're talking through their preferment. So, where's my next stage in my career and where do I go next when I don't want to work a 40-hour work week? So they're now thinking about moving out. Then you have my Gen Xers, those are like my aunties and my uncles, right? And they're moving up into senior level, higher level positions. And then you have millennials like myself. So I've been in my industry for 15 years. And when I first started, I was an individual contributor. Because I became a business owner, I stepped into a role of leadership earlier than most people in my demographic. However, what's happening is millennials are moving from, I'm no longer an individual contributor. Over the past 15 years, I've moved from IC to manager, probably into a director, and potentially breaking into a VP role. So, what does that mean? If I'm shifting up, well, who's coming in behind me? And what roles are they filling into? So here's the thing. Currently, there is a Gen Zer in my home, and he's my nephew. He's 24 years old. Nowhere on time. Always in the phone. Never shaking a hand. Has no desire to sit inside of a corporate building to do anything, right? And so just think about the risk in that. So if we thought the millennials were bad, and I can talk about that because I am one, then what do we think is going to happen as the Gen Zers may or may not want to play a role in this current workforce? And so these are some of the shifts that we're seeing, and it's important for us to pay attention to, because also while we're seeing these demographic shifts, there's also a knowledge transfer that's happening right now. And it's really important for us to be able to understand, as business continuity people, how do I plan for the continuity of the knowledge, right? So the third major force is rapid urbanization. So this is really important, especially for some of our inland cities that we partner with. And what we're seeing is many communities are preparing for the shift of people moving from coastal communities, or people moving from places where wildfires are more prevalent, into other communities where it might be a little bit safer, or where the natural disaster threat is a bit more tolerable. And so what's happening is, if you're in an inland city and maybe you're accustomed to a population of 30,000 people, and you have a police force, a firefighter, a water system, a sewage system, a school system, and healthcare systems that can support 30,000 people, what happens if that 30,000 increases by 30% or 50% or 200% within a 10 to 20-year period? Do you have the infrastructure to support that? And so we're partnering with organizations to go through infrastructure risk assessments. What are the vulnerabilities that we see from an infrastructure standpoint? And how do you truly prepare an inland city that was a smaller city to be a bigger player, to ensure that you can house the appropriate number of people, right? And so this is a significant concern because, while we need those different aspects of infrastructure, we didn't even touch on food and where is that going to come from, right? As well as water. So the fourth major force that came out of this report is shifts in global economic power. And so what does it look like as power shifts between developed and developing countries? So what's interesting is that this is cyclical. And if we look back 500 plus years, world powers shift and evolve over time. It's just the nature and the reality of the world. What's challenging is our generation has never experienced that. If you're born in America for the past probably 100 to 200 years, we've been a significant part of a world power. And what's interesting about specifically the US is, while we're a world power, compared to places like India or Asia, we have less people. And so what happens as power shifts between these different countries, different values, different ways of doing things, different expectations, and how do you manage that change with the generation that is not accustomed to that, right? And so the last major force that we'll talk through is resource scarcity and climate change. So what does it look like when we get into a space where fossil fuels are depleted, where there's continuous nonstop extreme weather, which some could argue that we're currently experiencing that now, just depending on your city, you don't see it every day. For example, Charlotte, North Carolina is in a disaster prone state because North Carolina is a coastal city, but we are not a disaster prone city. So the relationship to risk and emergency management in the city of Charlotte looks very different in Charlotte versus in Raleigh, North Carolina, or Wilmington, North Carolina, because those cities have to manage this disaster prone state a bit differently than Charlotte does. Rising sea levels and and water shortages. And so as you think about these major forces that will shape the year of 2030 as a prediction from a PricewaterhouseCoopers perspective, it's important for us to think about how does this impact our organization and the people within it? And then more specifically, what are some things that we can do to help absorb that or have that conversation so that we can really brace ourselves for what that impact may look like? And so, what I'd like to do is share with you 3 recommendations or strategies on what you can do as risk professionals. So, step number 1 is to utilize scenario mapping. So we took a look at Harvard Business Review, and in May of 2023, there was an article that came out about, the importance of change management. And change management's great, but change management is nothing without changing your mindset, right? And so what I liked about this is the concept of how do we think about what are some different scenarios that are happening and how do we utilize those scenarios to map out different alternatives or recommendations or solutions. And because we're risk planners, we love scenarios and exercises. So what I will do is I will talk through this at a high level, and on the next slide I'll begin to go through a specific example to give us some context. So no matter what your scenarios are that you want to map, we plotted 2 as an example. So one example could be on the x-axis, you have demographic shifts. On the top of the x-axis, it's an increased size of the distributed age profile. And on the bottom of the x-axis, it's demographic shifts decreasing in size. And then on the y-axis, you see urbanization. On the right-hand side of the y-axis, it's the significant population decrease in cities. And on the left-hand side, it's the significant population increase in cities. And so again, these x and y-axes can be interchanged. And what this scenario map enables you to do is to walk through these different quadrants and to understand, or just to really think about and scenario play, what might we, or how might we, or what if? And so for a specific example, I'll move on. And in this example, we're going to talk through technological breakthroughs. So on the x-axis, we have rapid innovation. And on the bottom of the x-axis, we have decreased innovation. On the y-axis, we have political shifts. So on the right-hand side, political shifts when power shifts, right? So the increase of power. Or on the left-hand side of the y-axis, what happens when political shifts or power stays the same? So I'll walk through 4 very high-level examples to give you some context, which this was really helpful because it forced us all to brainstorm about what does this really look like and how do you put this into motion. So let's say for the first quadrant, we're looking at technological breakthroughs that have rapid innovation, coupled with political shifts that stay the same. So political shifts in power that are staying the same. So what might that look like if this is my business? So one example that could look like, and really this example is insignificant in terms of the industry, but what it could look like is an increased dominance in the technology landscape. So let's unpack that. So if there is rapid innovation, but the political power shift is staying the same, then that might tell me that the current political structure is going to maintain the current status quo in terms of requirements, regulations, or policy as it relates to technology, which then might lead us to an increased dominance on tech companies or the tech environment. So for example, if I'm a Fortune 5 tech company and I'm a world power, then I might be able to drive more dominance in the tech landscape because I have the favor of rapid innovation plus political power shifts that are going to stay the same that work in my favor. Another idea in that same category is greater vulnerabilities to state infrastructure. And when I say state, I mean like cities, states, and governments, right? So again, if I have rapid innovation that's increasing and power shifts that stay the same, then it also might mean that the vulnerabilities that I have may also continue to increase from a state perspective which would then have an impact to the infrastructure that we all use in those environments, right? So this is an interesting example to kind of think through, okay, technological breakthroughs and political shifts are two things I cannot control, but they affect my business. So how do I begin to think through how do two things that I can't control, how do they show up different? How do they show up in my business? And what are all the different things that can happen? So the second concept that we have in the second quadrant is looking at what does it look like when there's rapid innovation in technology and there's political power shifts. So there's an increased opportunity to expand your technology market or shift reliance from China. So again, let's unpack that. So if I have rapid innovation from a technical perspective, but my political power shifts are shifting, what that tells me is depending on my business, I have an increased opportunity to expand the technology market because there's different political players at play and technology is also increasing. So my pool of the tech landscape and the tech market has the potential to increase. If I think about this specifically from a US perspective, depending on the election process and who's nominated and or elected, right? That could shift the reliance that we have on China just on technology. So what would happen if said president says, hey, no more business with China? So first of all, that's disruptive, right? Any change is disruptive. But second of all, the world at this point has a significant reliance on China. I'm looking at my 3 devices in here and they all were made in China. And if they weren't made in China, the parts that made it were made in China, right? So what it would do is it would actually create an opportunity in the market for there to become new players if this were to happen. So if I am, canvassing as a small business and looking at opportunities in the marketplace, this might be something that I'm paying attention to. What's happening politically? What's happening in the technology landscape? And is there an opportunity for me to enter into a new market, right? So let's look at the third quadrant. So what does it look like if my technology innovation is decreasing and my political power shifts are staying the same? In this example, there is a potential to reduce the speed of job displacement. So let's unpack that. Innovation has decreased. We're not moving as fast, slowing down. And the political power structures that exist are staying the same. So same status quo, same mindset, same people. Pick a place in the world, just think about the current structure and if that stays the same. That has the potential as an idea to reduce the speed of job displacement within your workforce, right? Which means, well, then maybe I'm not training people as much to, move forward with said technology. Maybe I can find more space in my company or in my firm to handle the workforce that we have. That might show up differently depending on your organization's reliance on technology. But regardless, this is a great workforce development strategy. And then the fourth bucket, right? What does it look like if I decrease the innovation from a tech perspective? And then when political power shifts or increases. So what that may look like is reduced investments. So investments could be investments in people, like your headcount, investments in financial investors, like dollars, or it could be investments in strategy. So again, let's unpack that. If my innovation is decreasing and power shifts politically are moving and changing and evolving, because people are typically concerned or they move slower, especially from a US perspective. I've seen this when we have elections, we kind of hold still and look around. Well, what's everybody else doing? If Google's doing it, then I'm gonna do it. If Facebook's doing it, then I'm gonna do it, right? So people kind of hold out and wait a minute to look at the landscape to see how is this threat profile or how is this new thing going to impact me and my business. And so people may slow down on how much I'm spending for headcount, how much I'm spending in investors, how much I'm spending to advance my technology strategy. I won't name names, but I have a friend of mine who works for who used to work for a big tech company, and they laid off 60,000 people in one day, right? So it has reduced the investments that they're making. So I'll pause for a second for you guys to kind of capture this.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and highlight something that you're doing here. First of all, I think that this is a very powerful model. And I wanted to pull some threads in with some of the concepts that we've been talking about on risk at work. What I read this model as is basically choosing two most salient dynamics that could affect your company and plotting them against what happens if they experience more volatility or less volatility. And we talk a lot on this program about the concepts of fragility, especially in the Nassim Taleb sense. So fragility, robustness, anti-fragility, and what that plays directly into this. What the definition of fragility in this context is that you do not like volatility, right? So you can operate well if any of these salient dynamics stay more or less as they are, but you are completely unprepared and not really wanting to explore the scenarios that would happen if one or both of these start kicking up dust at the exact same time. And what I love about your model is it forces you to think about those things, right? It forces you to embrace what happens if this dimension gets volatile, what happens if this dimension gets volatile, what happens if they both at the same time, and actually forces you into a place where you can accept and embrace volatility where it might not necessarily be your inclination. And if you can live in that top right quadrant, if you can be happy when everything gets volatile at once, when these salient dynamics get volatile at the same time, that's the trademark of what we would be calling an anti-fragile company, the companies that love and embrace volatility. So I think that this is, I don't want to interrupt your flow too much, but I want to highlight what you're doing here in terms of the importance of being able to be comfortable and be embracing of these kind of top and right quadrants where you might not necessarily want to think in those terms. Does that make sense, Vanessa? And I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
So it makes 100% sense. And the other thing that I thought about as you shared was, so, we're obviously talking to a group of risk managers and risk leaders, but at this point, everybody in the business owns some piece of risk. And so I also think that it's valuable tool for those of you where your corporate strategy plays a big role in how you manage your risk portfolio. I think this is an excellent exercise for your sales team, for your marketing team, for your operations team, for the leadership team, because we know that these things are happening and they impact our business. We talked about that, right? And so if we can help to strengthen this risk aware or this resilient culture to get them to think about these things in the business differently, I think it ultimately helps the things that we're trying to accomplish from a business continuity and enterprise risk perspective. So that's strategy one and recommendation one, utilize scenario mapping. Recommendation two, assess, plan, and train for political risks. Okay, Vanessa, what does this mean? So what you're looking at is a snapshot of an article, or excuse me, of a report or a study from a foreign policy group in April of 2023 that it was published that talked about how political risk shows up across different businesses. And so what you see on your x-axis are the years of 2020 through 2023, and on your y-axis, those are the percentages. And so what this is showing us is the proportion of people who responded who have experienced a political risk loss. Okay, well, what does a political risk loss look like? It could look like intensified geostrategic competition between world powers like the US, China, and Russia. It could look like greater frequency and intensity of First Amendment protests to social unrest to riots. It could look like intensified decoupling between China and the West. It could look like greater political focus on inequality. It could look like democracies no longer as democracies and shifting to a totalitarianism or authoritarianism type of structure, right? So what's interesting is that from 2020 through 2023, these experiences or these losses have continuously increased in these businesses. So now let's take another look at that. So this is a snapshot of the years on the x-axis, 2019 through 2023. For the most part, it's a trend upward. And again, on the x-axis, it shows the, or excuse me, on the y-axis, it shows the percentage of respondents or people who purchased political risk insurance because of those risks that we just talked through. So as a business owner, what I was always taught for the past, X number of years, follow the money. So no matter what business you're in, if you look at your P&L and your balance sheet, it'll tell you what problem I'm having in my business and how much money I'm spending in a certain area to solve that problem at the end of the day. And what I like about this is, number one, that I had no clue that political risk insurance even existed until my team came back and put this together.
I had no idea of it either. I was, we'll be coming back to that, trust me. But yeah, that was a new one for me. That blew me back.
Right? So what I like about this is it shows you I'm increasing in losses, and I'm also now starting to increase in my investment in those losses. So what are some examples of events that are covered by political risk insurance? That can show up as war, it can show up as insurrections, it can show up as terrorism, breach of contracts. It can also show up as specific government action, so new laws or regulations that directly affect a company's operations, and having the ability to interfere with their ability to perform their critical functions. Critical functions, business continuity, tie back into that. And so what's interesting is Scott and I relate to the party, but apparently political risk insurance has been around since the 1970s, and it started to take shape after World War II. And so the reason why I think this is important is because if we take a look back at these 5 forces, politics is involved in every single one of them. They influence or you set the policy for all 5 of these forces. Let's just say PwC is right? It shows up in all 5 of them. And the reason why that's important is because politics impact our business. There's a certain southern state, I won't name it, in the United States, and there's a political candidate who's running for office in that state. And on the news the other day, I saw the state, I saw the governor, and then I saw a huge amusement park. And it was those 3 parties in the same picture. And the point of that is that business may or may not have wanted to be in that picture or to be in that frame on the news. And so the reality is that politics impact our business. If you are an electronics company, we have clients who produce electronics around the world. If most of your parts are coming from other countries like China or Mexico, et cetera, they too are in the news. And so it's unrealistic to think that the political environment that we're in, not just from a US perspective, but globally, is not causing an impact to your business. And so that's why we think it's important. We want to help you see so you can solve, right? So assess, what are the political risks that I'm experiencing in my environment that impact my business? What are the plans that we have in place to be able to mitigate that? What I love about the world of enterprise risk is I have my heat map. I know what the risks are. I know what the controls are. I know my control risk treatment plans, right? But then business continuity takes it a step further to say, hey, great, you have insurance, check the box. It helps you maybe from a financial cushion perspective. But what it doesn't account for is how does this political risk impact my people, my suppliers, my assets, and my technology when it starts to impact my critical business functions? And then let's train for that. So then the question becomes, when we do our next tabletop, when's the next tabletop that we're going to have that's stemming from one of these political risks that companies have clearly seen losses in, right? And so that's the second strategy that you can take back to think about how to implement that in your business. The third strategy that we have before we wrap is strategies around how to manage anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion threats. So why is this important? Because in the layman's terms, I think of DE&I as my reminder to be a good human being. No matter if I like you or not, no matter where you come from, no matter your ethnic background, how do you be a decent human, right? How do I think about things I didn't think about before? How do I put things into perspective for people who have different experiences than me and honor that, whether I'll agree with it or not, just respect it, right? And so what we're seeing, and because we have many relationships and partnerships with higher ed institutions, what we're seeing are a number of risks, vulnerabilities, and threats that organizations are facing across the country, specifically from a US perspective. So what that has shown up as is there's more vulnerability to biased claims that are happening within places of business. Organizations also are on the hook to potentially lose funding. Well, if I lose funding, how do I run my business, right? I always said, if you don't have people, you don't have a business. Well, if you don't have money, you definitely don't have a business. Barring mandatory diversity training, there may be private businesses who want to require that as a business because it may support your values or your culture or et cetera. So how does that look if I'm currently now in a state that is prohibiting me to be able to offer such things that I may find of value? Removing diversity statements and applications for employment or admissions. And how does that show up and impact your talent pipeline in the pool of qualified candidates? Allowing students and employees to sue if they are required to participate in DE&I training. What does that look like now, especially with what's happening from an affirmative action perspective? As a key example, the Louisiana Board of Regents shared that the efforts to curb DE&I will lead to a number of concerns, just specifically within the state of Louisiana. One, it leads to a lack of equitable access for up to 28 to 30 key institutions across the state. That further impacts those classrooms because those classrooms now reflect a smaller viewpoint and less experiences, right? Which impacts my experience as a paying college student, right? It also undercuts their goal and a strategic goal to help 60% of the state's working age adults to get a college degree or a credential by 2030. In order to help drive upward mobility in communities, diversity is needed to provide access to people who typically have not received access. Access could be, I'm hard of hearing. How do I get access for what I need because I have a disability that may be seen or unseen, right? In the city where I live in Charlotte, there was a Chetty study that was done with Harvard years ago. Charlotte is 50 out of 50 for upward mobility. So if you're born poor in Charlotte, you have a 97% chance of likelihood of leaving poverty, of staying in poverty, which means you have 3% of making it out. So we have to be very intentional in our city about upward mobility and the pipeline of talent from high school to college or institutions into the private or the public sector. And with challenges that we're currently facing in America with affirmative action, it prohibits those abilities, so what does that mean? As a business owner, I live in a community. So if the people around me in my community are not doing well, then how does that show up for my business, right? And then lastly, the challenge that was expressed in the Louisiana Board of Regents was that, so colleges and universities can still articulate the benefit of diversity of inclusion in the general terms, and it can achieve the things that they may want to accomplish. But the concern is that without the explicit consideration of race, of ethnicity, of gender, and identity, it kind of softens what the conversation is. And what I can appreciate is being surrounded by risk professionals. We value root cause. We value problems, right? We value calling a thing a thing. A risk is different than a threat. A crisis is not a catastrophe. A disaster is not an incident, right? Words matter. And so why this is important is in the world of DE&I, where we're managing these inclusion threats, words matter. And so it's very important for us to be able to call a thing a thing. And so if you're in an organization where this may be happening in your city, your state, your region, or you can see it coming. What do you do about that? So, number one, evaluate state laws and how those things are approaching, or how your communities and governments are approaching DE&I efforts and education practices. And I'll give you a short example of why that's important. When I used to work in the corporate arena, I worked at a Fortune 200 aircraft manufacturing company. And if you can paint a Honda Civic, it does not mean that you can paint a Gulfstream G650 airplane. There's two different skill sets. And so we thought, well, just find whoever's painting cars and they can paint planes. No, man, it's a different mindset, it's a different skill set. And so we had to be intentional about where we recruited people from and the partnerships we had with the higher ed institutions in our region to truly recruit the talent so that we can manage the continuity of people, right? And so the partnership with those education institutions mattered in an aircraft manufacturing environment. And so it's important for you to understand how these laws have the potential to impact the education practices in your community. The second strategy for you from a DEI perspective is to assess the higher ed partnerships within your organization. What are you getting from those different partners and how does that show up for your business? And the reason why is you want to understand where those sources of talent are coming from so that you can continue to maintain, from a BCP perspective, maintaining the continuity of my people and quality people, right? Number four, evaluate the impact of how that shows up from an economic development perspective on your employees, your vendors, and your operations. In our state of North Carolina, we had a legislature who passed a bill that was not favorable to diverse communities. And the concern with that was it prohibited our state from receiving different programs, different companies to relocate to North Carolina, which impacted what? Economics, which is money. It had an impact on every community, on every city, on every region. And so it's important for you to evaluate how these things show up from a dollars perspective, because, for example, if I'm the anchor, if I'm a Walmart, if I'm the number one employer in a city or a town, and we have laws and policies that impact my ability to attract other employers, that's impacting my ability to stay afloat in that community. The worst thing that can happen is if I'm in a town of 30,000 people and Walmart is my anchor, if Walmart closes its doors because of whatever challenges that may exist in that environment, it's bigger than just the revenue of Walmart, right? What does that do to that entire community? And so it's important that we think about that and bring those things to the table from a risk perspective to advocate. And then lastly, utilize scenario mapping to identify what those risks and threats look like. So before I turn over to Scott, I want to say this. Fear can keep a man out of danger, but courage only can support him in it. Courage may not always accompany fear, but fear is a necessary companion to courage. Courage means making a clear-eyed assessment of the real risks involved and striving for a worthy goal, and then acting in the face of those risks despite the fear that they may cause. What I love about this industry is we get paid to speak the truth. We get paid to find the root cause and to solve those with real strategies to protect the people, the businesses, and the communities that we're in. And sometimes we got to have a lot of courage because we're facing a lot of fear. And so I want to encourage this community to move forward with courage. So I'm going to turn it back over to Scott.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I loved how you wrapped up. I thought that was a great sentiment to wrap up your message on. This industry is about finding and speaking the truth, however hard that is, and the more dire the circumstances, as you commonly deal with, as we all commonly deal with, the harder that is to do a lot of times, especially when people may dismiss the idea of certain eventualities. I remember one of our clients was telling us during the course of the pandemic that in their ERM program, he brought up the idea of pandemic risk as something to be part of the risk register in the conversation, and the idea was laughed out of the room. And then that was probably in the 6 months before everything broke loose. So these things do require courage. I think we have time for maybe one question here, but I'm curious. So uh, from this audience's perspective, they've heard your message. They want to get going on either a program or an addendum to their current program, but they want to take a more serious look at uncontrollable risks as you prescribe here. And they want to start a kind of a conversation, or they want to start some kind of process or procedure for this. How would you advise them to get started putting processes and programs in place to do exactly what you're saying here, and take a consistent and serious look at uncontrollable risks?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. In simplicity, I would say assess, plan, train, right? So it's hard for me to take action if I don't really know what am I taking action on. So how do
Mhm.
we see so we can solve? So typically that may be a great internal audit that's always got our back
Right.
to to scare everything out of the upper echelon that run the organization. But I think it's important to take a look at what are the most concerning, uncontrollable events that we see that have the potential to impact our business, and what may be the top two or three that we see them on our risk profile or in our risk dash report, but we don't really have a true sense of if this really were to happen, what are we actually going to do? And
Mhm.
so I think it's important to play that scenario out. I would encourage you to maybe go through a 2 to half day exercise and just use that scenario mapping and map out those different quadrants and be intentional to really force people to think, and then bringing in your different stakeholders from your different departments to talk through how that shows up for their business. And what's great about that is then you get the buy-in and then everybody feels as heavy as you do, right? So
Right.
once you have that, then let's put a plan together to say, great, these are two external risks that I can't control, but they directly impact me. Now, what are we going to do about it? How much time are we going to spend? How many people will it take us? And what are the resources required to make it happen? And then put your plan together. And then from there, it allows you to make an investment in the business.
I should have asked the question, what other than hiring Vanessa Mathews can one do to get started, right? But I mean, that was implicit. This is a very smart group of people that we're with here. And so they already knew that. But speaking about that, Vanessa, where can people keep in touch with you and what you're doing?
So there's two things. Number one, you can scan this, and what our team has put together is an electronic template to help you evaluate threats and strategies to help you manage resilience for the business. So that's number one. The second way that you can stay in contact is by our information sheet. So Scott kind of ripped on me a little bit, but literally our phone number is 1-833 advise me.
I dare you to forget that phone number.
And then our social media handles are at as follows advisors, and then at business resilience decoded.
I want to give you a tremendous thank you, Vanessa, not only for your material today, but for coming and being a Risk at Work presenter, and part of the pantheon of great presenters that we have for this program. It's knowledgeable people like you, experts coming on that make this program what it is. So from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of our audience here today, thank you very much. To the rest of you, thank you for spending time with us today. If you would like updates as to when Vanessa is speaking next, please come to riskconnect.com. If you have not already, sign up for our newsletter. And if you want to have a conversation about unpredictable risk or business continuity of any kind, please reach out to a Risk Connect representative. We would love to talk to you about your specific business and your specific concerns. Vanessa, is tremendous. Thank you so much for your time. And to all of you, we will see you on the next installment of Risk at Work. Take care.